I'd like to welcome you guys to another episode of Reasonable Discourse. And we're going to deal with the issue of sequestration. We're going to talk about some of the budget debates and the concern about the debt, and also talk about how it's impacting us here in Virginia. And from a historical standpoint, let me sort of ask you this, Sean. A lot of folks talk about that we are in an era of polarization politically that folks think is something beyond the ordinary that we haven't seen before. Is that really the case?
I'm not sure that I would say we've never seen it before, but it's certainly unusual to see it at this level. If I had to pull an example, I would say that we're probably, in my opinion, back in the late 1850s, where the country had become so polarized over slavery versus abolition that any sort of reasonable discourse was nearly impossible.
Of course, now back in the 1850s, Sean, is when we had congressmen carrying weapons onto the floor of the
You had
the
to
House.
go packing heat in the Senate if you wanted to survive.
Charles Sumner was nearly caned to death by Preston Brooks. And so I'm not sure how reassuring it is that you compare our current political turmoil to the 1850s. But
Sometimes we don't need reassurance. We need to be pointed to harsh realities. And sometimes I think we're not that far from it. Remember, Preston Brooks got a lot of canes sent to him afterward as thanks from the Southern constituents who wanted him to use it some more.
Well, if you look at some of the competing budget proposals we've seen recently from the House Republicans and more recently from the Senate Democrats, it seems like they're just fishing for more canes instead of actually trying to reach some type of realistic compromise on these issues.
Yeah, there's a lot of political gamesmanship going on in the current debate. Whether it's sequestration itself, the Democratic budget, the new Paul Ryan budget, pretty much everything's being sent out there for political points. There does not seem to be a great deal of interest in actually coming up with something that works. But then again, what's the motive? Why would they?
Well, let's talk a little bit about sequestration and the impact that it may have. I think folks understand that it was a series of mandated cuts as part of a bargain last year between the President and Congress. And the idea is that these cuts were so terrible, so atrocious, that the President and Congress would never actually allow them to happen because they would be forced into a bargain.
Now, whose bargain was this?
I'm
That's
not
one
sure.
question.
Yeah, and it didn't work out. They did not reach that deal to avoid these cuts. And I think some people, Sean, would say that the cuts themselves, the amount of the cuts, are not so onerous, but they're very arbitrary. And we look at some of the problems that we have with our national debt, some of the issues we face. A lot of folks say one of the big problems we have is because we have this huge chunk of our budget going to entitlements, yet in sequestration we only have about 4% of the cuts affect entitlements. Instead, a lot of it deals with military defense spending and also with discretionary spending. What are the long-term effects if we can't get this thing taken care of and these cuts stay in place? How will we feel it here in Virginia, for example?
Well, first let me address the long-term ramifications, because the problem we've had is that if we didn't come up with the budget or initiate the sequestration cuts, we were in danger of having the national credit rating lowered even more.
Correct.
In a sense, sequestration made sure our credit rating didn't fall, but at the cost of, last I saw, 90,000 jobs in Virginia. Virginians who work for the Department of Defense, they're going to be furloughed. And that means less income for them, harder time paying rent. They're not going to be going out to dinner very often. Businesses, of course, are going to be hit by that. And federal work study, a lot of our students will be told, sorry, your hours are cut in half. You are no longer allowed to work, which means they don't get to live on as much money either.
And I guess we might have to reveal what we would call a conflict of interest here. We are state employees.
So far, it's not hit us.
It has not hit us, but of course, because Virginia is so heavily dependent on federal money,
It will.
I think, and it depends on what kind of damage you look at, but it appears that Virginia may be the third most affected state by sequestration. And
they're already discussing, I believe, $14 million coming out of Virginia's education system by the end of this year, but that's going to hit primary and secondary. So if you have children in school, there's going to be a problem.
And so we may not be feeling the pinch right now, and you know, we've had the stock market has continued to reach record highs, so we may not be feeling that pinch yet, but I think most folks believe that eventually this is going to show up with that absence of government spending, the impact that you're talking about. We're going to start to feel it in our whole economic system, and that's when things will get a little ugly, I suppose.
Of course, remember also the stock market is an invented thing. The Dow Jones Industrial Average only tracks a limited number of stocks, most of which probably are not going to be hit by sequestration. So the economy may well get worse. The Dow will probably continue going up and looking fine.
So we'll feel it before the folks who are buying stocks will probably.
Yeah, long before they do.
Yeah. Well, let's go to the long-term issue. We know that we have a serious issue with national debt right now. How do we address that in the long term? And what are some of the competing ideas, and why is it that Republicans and Democrats have a hard time coming to a consensus about how to deal with this issue?
Part of it is it's just not that easy. It's not so much that you have a debt and you need to pay it down. We've done that before, but that was back in the 1820s. By about 1830, Andrew Jackson paid off the national debt completely. Of course, his national debt was a pittance.
Right.
Our debt is not just what we owe. It's tied up in bonds. It's tied up in loans that other countries hold titles to. It's, in a way, it's a good governing mechanism over the United States. If the main superpower in the world is that deeply in debt, then China and Russia can hold a lot of that debt to themselves. It kind of guarantees the U.S. doesn't get too far out of control. So there's sort of a diplomatic reason that you don't want to completely do away with the debt, at least from the point of view of other countries.
Sure. Maybe not here in America, though.
Not here in America. And depending if you're a Republican or Democrat, of course, depends on what you think should be cut.
Well, that's sort of interesting. The competing plans that have come out, and we're still waiting for President Obama to come out with his budget plan, but in the Republican plan that Paul Ryan engineered, saw something interesting. Generally, you think about a debt, you think about the notion of increasing both revenue while decreasing, increasing the amount coming in through revenue, but decreasing the amount that's being expended. I noticed that the highest tax rates in the Paul Ryan plan were actually reduced from 35% to 25% income tax. And one thing that he mentioned was the repeal of the Affordable Health Care Act, often referred to as Obamacare. And I noticed it was interesting in a press conference, Representative Ryan said that elections have consequences, which I thought was an interesting statement for someone who is proposing the repeal of the Affordable Health Care Act, considering the U.S. Senate election in 2010 and the presidential election in 2012 just about made that sure that we were not going to be repealing Obamacare. So what do you think about the Republican approach? What are the strengths, and maybe where do the Republicans sort of miss out on reality?
To an extent, I think what's happening, and I know this is cynical, they understand the American electorate better than we give them credit for. Notice the timing. We've just had a presidential election for 2012. There will not be another national election for 2 years. So they've hit us really right at the end of an electoral cycle. We're tired. How many Americans are going to remember the sequester or much of this argument of the budget when it comes time for 2014? I think in that sense, the timing is perfect. They understand most Americans are not going to remember. Their seats are pretty much going to be safe. We don't turn out congressmen like we used to.
Sure. And that's even when you think about these dramatic congressional elections like 2010, still nearly 80% of incumbents win in those elections.
Yeah, it's not like the old days. You go back to the 1830s, 1840s, you can sometimes see Congress being turned out at a rate of 45% of the congressmen. The highest one I'm aware of actually took place in the Confederacy in 1862's election, where over 70% of the Confederate Congress was actually elected out. We just don't do that anymore.
Well, we often hear the adage is throw the bums out, but it seems to be more realistic approach of folks is throw the bums out, but not my bum.
Not my bum.
I like him or her, and I want to keep them in Congress. So I know the Republican plan does try to tackle the issue, and we don't have a lot of details in either of these plans right now. There's a lot of gaps in both of them. But the issue of entitlements, could you kind of explain to folks what do we mean when we talk about entitlements anyway?
Entitlements, we're discussing social programs, welfare, Social Security, food stamps. Technically, you can consider financial aid for students to be in an entitlement. The idea really of anything that an individual gets from the federal coffers, and in particular a program that tends to be protected through allocations where it's not actually part of the general budget process. It's automatically spent, and generally Congress doesn't have a control over it on a budget-to-budget basis.
And one of the big issues we're dealing with entitlements today, especially with the rising tide of health costs, would be Medicare, Medicaid, which seems to be a big issue. It seems like the Republican plans are more set on dealing with entitlements at the other end, while maintaining perhaps tax breaks or lower tax rates for perhaps wealthier Americans, as we saw.
The ideological divide.
The ideological divide, whereas Democrats want to protect entitlements at all costs, while are much more willing to increase the tax rates.
Which gets, I think, to an interesting argument that's actually below the surface. We don't really discuss it openly, but it's really at the heart of what's going on. And it's really a view of religion that's happening in this country. And what I mean by that is on the Democrat side, most of the Democrats who are in favor of entitlements, who are in favor of social welfare programs, tend to be what we call social gospelers. They do believe that there is a responsibility for the state, for the citizens, to take care of the poorest and the weakest among us. They see that as their read of the gospel. On the other side, you have those who see religion, we tend to associate the far right with the most religious part of the population, but their read is completely different. They tend to see it as propping up people who may be lazy. They do not see giving entitlements as a Christian duty. And in fact, many on the right tend to actually follow the writings of an now deceased woman, Ayn Rand, who came out of Russia and who often is called the prophet of selfishness. She saw sort of a bold-faced competition, a survival of the fittest, as the best way to keep a country going, to keep an economy going. And so you have these two philosophical views, both of which consider themselves to be really carrying forward the proper religion, because it's always getting couched in religion if you scratch under the surface. And we're fighting it in the budget.
And it's interesting because that same divide between the social gospel and social Darwinism has been going on for 130 years now. It started out in the 19th century. Most folks who are not necessarily as partisan, we think about the Bowles-Simpson Commission that came up with their plan for reeling the debt, seem to look at a combination of things, both increasing taxes in some cases, but at the same time getting a rein on entitlements. Do you think we have the political willpower to pull this off anytime soon? The great bargain that they talk about, the grand bargain?
Hasn't happened yet.
Yeah.
There's too much to gain. I think that there's just too much to gain for both sides to keep the debate going. But that's politics. Sometimes you don't want to solve the problem. You want to keep the fight alive because in the end you might wind up winning.
And 2014 is actually just around the corner in political terms.
In political terms. Which reminds me, I'm curious what your take on 2014 will be. What do you think? Sequestration, the budget, do you even see an effect on 2014? What would it be?
You know, I think it may be too early to tell. We've seen polls, as we're apt to see about any issue, come out, and it seems like initially a lot of the blame politically may have been on the Republicans. Their numbers haven't changed much, but the president's numbers have gone down. So who knows? I'm not sure we'll see a resolution to this anytime soon. Well, I don't know that we've solved this issue today, but
we've made it muddier and hopefully it's slightly more interesting.
Yeah, hope so. But thank you again for being with us on another episode of Reasonable Discourse.
Have a good evening.